Hello, this is the page that we're going to be looking at tonight. It's the first page in your notes on your Canvas website titled Judaism. Hopefully you've downloaded them or printed them out or something. And there's 20-some pages, 22 pages, something like that in it if I remember right. But we're just going to basically look at the first page tonight. And these are the four major periods in the development of Judaism. You'll remember we did the same thing when we looked at Hinduism. We started out with different periods. And the reason we did that is because there are some major changes that take place in the religion. In fact, one of the reasons for the major changes in Hinduism is the same reason for major changes in Judaism, and it's that period of time we call the Axial Age, from about 800 to 200 BCE. And we've talked a lot about that in class and in previous videos and so on, so I'm not going to rehash all of that. But that also affects Judaism, because Judaism and Hinduism are the two religions that are a little bit unique among the world religions, because both of them existed for a great deal of time before the Axial Age. And so we can observe in this same religious tradition great changes as a result of the Axial Age. So obviously one of the transitional events here is going to be the Axial Age. And so as you look at our four periods here, you'll see in between the second and the third period there, it says interim period, Babylonian exile of the Jews. That is right in the middle of the Axial Age period. You'll see 586 to 538 BCE. And as we'll see, when the Judahites are taken captive into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, they're there a little over half a century or so until they are actually set free by the Persian king, great King Cyrus, who's defeated the Babylonians. And he allows the Jews to go back and rebuild their land, Judah. But when they come back, we find that they have very different religious ideas as a result of this Axial Age transition. So we're going to talk about this. We have two other events that are transitionary that are unique to Judaism. The first one, between periods 1 and 2, they're the patriarchal and the Israelite religion period, you see. There's an interim period where after migration to Egypt, the Israelites become slaves there, and they're there for 430 years. And when they come out of Egypt, well, it's a whole different story than when they went in. So that's a major transition lasting centuries. And then the final transition between 3 and 4 is actually the last event, the last line in the section 3 there, where it says the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, or AD if you prefer. And that destruction of the temple really does change an awful lot in Judaism. So those are the major events we're going to look at. Let's go back to the patriarchal period and start there. Patriarch, of course, is a father. And so Judaism has a patriarchal period where we're looking at the fathers of the religion. Now, in Judaism, the first 4 generations are considered the fathers. Abraham, his son Isaac, Isaac's son Yaakov, or Jacob, who also is renamed Israel, and then Israel's 12 sons, who become the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the patriarchs, if you will. We can't date Abraham precisely, but to say somewhere around 2000 BCE for his birth is within a couple hundred years of being correct. So we can just think about 4,000 years before present to date Abraham. Interesting thing about Abraham is that he is considered the founder of all 3 of the major monotheistic religions. They all esteem him as their founder and treat him with great honor. And of course, I'm talking about Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Now, we live in an age now where there's a whole bunch of propaganda running around and a lot of haters. And so there's a possibility that some of you may have heard some hate speak, or maybe not even hatefully delivered, but just misinformation that has lasted for centuries that maybe you've heard from somewhere, or it could be information that somebody has come up with, more recently. But in any case, the idea, for instance, that Muslims and Christians say worship a different God is ridiculous. Historically, it has always been understood as the very same God. In fact, Muslims consider Abraham to be their founder, and Ismail, the son of Abraham, that they consider the founder of their, religion, if not their actual lineage, is also a son of Abraham, just like Isaac. They both worship their father's God. They both love the same God. And so today there are some people, obviously 9/11 has a lot to do with it, that really didn't know much about Islam, and their whole definition of Islam has been defined by the events of 9/11, even though they were perpetrated by a very, very small group of people. And as a result, their whole understanding of Islam is skewed, radically skewed. And they've heard teachings about how Muslims worship a false god and all of this, and but nothing could be farther from the truth. Now, there's a great deal of disagreement between Christians and Jews and Muslims about maybe how to worship this same God, or some theological beliefs or whatever. But it's still the same God. It's still the same religious tradition. Muslims honor all of the Hebrew prophets, all of them, all the way up to Jesus. They believe in Jesus' virgin birth. They believe in all of his miracles. And later on, we'll get to, when we get to Islam, we'll get to some of the theological differences. You know, you're going to have to get it out of your head right now if you happen to have heard any misinformation that resembles anything that I just said, by example. Abraham's considered the father of all three of the major world religions. Both Christianity and Islam consider the Hebrew Bible, Christians call it the Old Testament, Hebrews call it the Tanakh. Christians and Muslims consider that to be a holy book. They consider all of those prophets to be real prophets. And in the case of Islam, they also consider Jesus to be a great prophet. And as I said, believe in his virgin birth and all of his miracles. You're going to find an awful lot more similarities between these three religions than you might expect. Some of you might know, but some of you have been led to believe that they're so different that this might be a surprise to you. Anyway, let's get going here. So the patriarchal period, this guy named Abraham is born, and Abraham is actually living in an area that today is southern Iraq, and he has some kind of visitation from God, and it doesn't give all the details of it, but God tells him to pick up and leave his people. Of course, 4,000 years ago, polytheism, that's just the way it is. You know, in all of the advanced societies, they have pantheons of gods that they worship. Monotheism doesn't exist anywhere. And so Abraham has some kind of a contact from this one God. And he tends to call him El Shaddai, God Almighty. He has some other names for him too, but doesn't really know a proper name for this God. Doesn't seem to need to have one. We'll find out 600 years later, God finally tells his proper name to Moses, and that's where we get the name Yahweh. But at this time, apparently, that name doesn't seem to be known. Abraham just calls his God El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. This God tells Abraham to leave his people and to pack up and move, take everything, and go to a land that he's going to show Abraham. God's going to show Abraham. And God is promising that he is going to give this land to Abraham's descendants forever. And Abraham does not have a child at the time. And he's 75. His wife is 65, Sarah. She's never had a child. And has been infertile her whole life, and, you know, at 65 is probably postmenopausal. So when God tells Abraham that he is going to give him a son through Sarah, that might be a little difficult to believe, but Abraham believes it. It's going to be 25 years, though, before this child is born. I'm sorry, I should have told you it was a spoiler alert. It's okay, the story's interesting anyway. It isn't until Abraham is 100 and Sarah's 90 that this child is finally born that God has promised. And we'll talk more about all of these stories later on. I'm just going to go through this timeline quickly just to give you an idea. I'm going to tell you a lot more details in the stories later on, okay? So Abraham picks up with his whole family and moves to this land that God is promising to give to his descendants, which of course at the time don't exist. He doesn't even have a son yet. And he goes there with his wife and takes his cousin Lot and many flocks and herds and servants. Abraham's a pretty rich guy. He's not some poor guy, you know, that has nothing to lose. I mean, he's packing up a lot of stuff and moving here. And so they go to this land, which at the time is called Canaan or Canaan, we would call it today. And Abraham lives there, you know, peaceably among the people for the most part, unless he's provoked and has to defend himself. But he's a pastoralist. Fancy word for a semi-nomadic shepherd, people that have big flocks and herds and they have to keep moving them around. You know, after they've completely eaten all the vegetation in one area, you've got to move your flocks and herds somewhere where they have something else to eat. So you're semi-nomadic. You might be staying in sort of the same area, but you're always moving around, you know, a little bit. And so he settles in this land of Canaan. He has two sons there, named Ishmael and Isaac, okay? And or Yitzhak, and these are the two sons of Abraham. And as we're going to find out later on, I mentioned earlier, Islam focuses more on the firstborn son Ishmael, where Judaism and Christianity focus more on the second-born son, Yitzhak, or Isaac. And so we're, from this point on, going to talk about the story according to the history in Judaism. And then when we get to Islam, we'll note some of the changes. But anyway, Jews consider the son Isaac to be the chosen son of Abraham, that is inheriting the blessing that God has given to Abraham. And when we start talking about the story of Abraham, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how blessings work, how the firstborn son usually gets a double blessing, and a lot of other things like that. But for now, I'm going to just kind of leave that behind. Isaac has two sons named Esau and Jacob, or Jacob. And Esau is actually the firstborn, only by a little bit of time. They're both born the same day, they're fraternal twins. But Jacob ends up being the one that inherits this blessing from God. And God himself, later in Jacob's life, gives him a name change, changes his name to Israel, after God has done a lot of work in Jacob's life to make him the man that he can finally bless. Jacob doesn't start out being a very good guy. He's kind of a con man. But God sees what he will become when he's done working in his life. And by the way, this is a major motif. God chooses people that really don't deserve it. They're not the right people in terms of their qualifications or their social status or even their ethical moorings. And Jacob's a great example, but when God gets done with him, he's a much better man than he was at the beginning of the story. And again, we're going to tell you the whole story. It's a very interesting one. So Jacob, or Israel, has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. You might have heard that. And I will tell you some interesting stories about his sons. It's one son whose name is Joseph. And Joseph ends up being in a position of great authority in Egypt. And nobody in his family really knows where he's at. He's had a falling out with his brothers that has something to do with how he ended up in Egypt. And again, I'll tell you the whole story. But a great famine hits, and Israel, aka Jacob, and his sons and their wives and children and grandchildren and servants and flocks and herds all end up migrating to Egypt, because Egypt actually has food largely because of the actions of Joseph. And they are reunited with their brother there, with Israel's son, and the other 11 brothers, of course, meet their brother. They're a little bit scared because they've actually treated Joseph badly, but he forgives them all, gives them great land, treats them well, and they're very honored foreigners in Egypt. Unfortunately, there is a dynasty change, and the new dynasty does not like the Israelites, does not like the Hebrews. By the way, those are the two terms we can use at this point. Hebrew would be more the ethnic term. Israelite, we wouldn't use that because there's not enough of them yet. But, 400 years later, when there's hundreds of thousands of them, Israelite's a pretty descriptive term. It means that every one of those people is descended from that one man named Israel. Talk about a multitude of descendants. But those would be the proper terms at this point in time. We don't use the term Jew yet. Jew is really Judahite, and Judah is one of the 12 sons. So one of the tribes you would call Judahites or Jews. And we'll explain how the whole religion and nation ends up being called Judah in just a little bit. Anyway, they end up being made slaves by this new government, like I said, that overthrew the government that liked them. And the new government doesn't consider them friends of the new government. If anything, it's the new government is more worried about them because they were allies of the old government. And they're multiplying so quickly, the new government's scared of them. So the new government puts them under very, very harsh supervision and control, takes away their civil rights, and puts them to work as slaves of the crown. And after being in Egypt 430 years, there is a man of the Israelites that God raises up. You'll hear the term raised up a lot. Raises up and anoints, another term you'll hear a lot. He raises up this guy Moses and anoints him to lead the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt. And if you know anything about the story, maybe you heard of the old movie called The Ten Commandments. Really was one of the old great Hollywood movies before any kind of CGI. The kind of movie that they would announce by saying cast of thousands. And what they meant by that was there were really thousands of people. You didn't have animation that could make it look real. So when you see huge crowds of people walking across the desert in very, very elaborate costumes, there were hundreds of seamstresses sitting around sewing all of those costumes. It was a very big deal the way they made movies in the old days. But this is one of those just legendary movies with a cast of thousands, again, called The Ten Commandments. And Moses does some amazing miracles that finally convinces a very hard-hearted Pharaoh to let the people go. And there's much more to this story, as I said, we're going to talk about later. But the idea is Moses is leading these people back to this land of Canaan that God had promised to them about 600 years before. And that's why we call it the Promised Land, because it was promised to Abraham, somewhere around 2000 BCE, give or take a couple hundred years. So Moses leads them back to Canaan. Moses actually doesn't lead them into Canaan himself. He's an old man by that time, but he has a sidekick named Joshua that actually leads them into Canaan. On the way to Canaan, though, they stop at a place called Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, and you might have heard of it. It's where Moses receives a great covenant from God. Now, this is the second important covenant in the history of Israel. The first one is the covenant that God makes with Abraham, and this is the one we're going to be talking about in the very next lecture. We'll be getting to this. And this is the covenant that God is going to give Abraham a son of his presumably barren wife, and that his son is going to have a multitude of descendants, and that God is going to give them this land of Canaan forever. So 600 years later, Moses is leading them back into this land that was promised to Abraham. And he enters into a covenant with God for all of these people. And we've heard of the 10 Commandments. This is actually the heart of this covenant here, but there's 613 actual directives in it. And it talks about everything, not just religious ritual and practice, but many, many other aspects of, the way that the nation is supposed to be regulated. And so covenant is probably the best term for it. And a lot of us don't have a great understanding of how covenants work. So the very next lecture, I'm going to be talking a little bit about covenant just to make sure we're on the same page and we understand how this works. This is another area, kind of like I mentioned at the very beginning of this video here. This is another area where there may be some very bad information going around, and some of it is kind of hung on for centuries. And so I'm going to take a little while talking about covenant and try to undo some of the bad information you might have heard about what covenantal theology is. But at any rate, this covenant that Moses receives from God, we call the Mosaic covenant because it came through Moses. The first covenant we call the Abrahamic covenant because it came through Abraham. So Moses is the one who receives this covenant. And this is, again, what is supposed to direct Israel's religious practice as well as every other area of their lives. It is actually Moses's number one sidekick, Joshua, that leads the Israelites into Canaan land. They subdue the land over a few decades, and some of the peoples that are dwelling there, they overtake by force. Others they make treaties with. Moses tells them, though, before they go into the land, be careful. Don't worship the gods of the Canaanites when you get in there. I mean, the only God you're supposed to worship is this God Yahweh that brought you out of Egypt, that freed you. And we mentioned this before when we were talking about henotheism. I'm sure you remember this story because I gave the example. I probably mentioned it more than once. But the Israelites, when they get into Canaan, they do exactly what Moses told them not to do. They end up worshiping not just Yahweh, but all of these other gods. And the theological import of the book of Joshua and the book of the Judges and many books after that is that it is because of this idolatry, this worshiping of the wrong gods, that so many bad things happen to Israel. This is God chastening them or punishing them or disciplining them. And you may already be somewhat familiar with this, most of you having grown up in a nation where monotheism is more well known than any other type of religion. After they get into this land, we have a period we call the period of the judges. And there are 12 different judges that rule Israel. And most of them are unwilling rulers. They're not really rulers. They're more like captains of the host. Israel will get attacked by some outside army, some outside nation. And again, usually the theological import is that God's letting this happen because the people have been worshiping the wrong gods or doing something wrong. And so when the Israelites get attacked, they have to send messengers, all over to all the different tribes wherever they're at to tell them to all come together and let's fight these, people that are invading. Let me just go to a map here and give you an idea what we're looking at here. Okay. When they settle in this land, the land is divvied up among the 12 tribes based on how big the tribes are and how many people are in the tribes there. And as you can see, the largest tribe there by far is the tribe of Judah. So this is the way it's divided up. So, if someone, gets attacked somewhere in the area of Manasseh or Dan or whatever, they have to send messengers running, to all of the other tribes to tell them to come and help us and fight. Problem is, most of the people are involved in farming, so they have to take their farm implements and they have to take the bronze and beat the bronze into weapons, whether swords or hatchets or whatever. And then they have to, a multitude of people on foot have to come and meet. And by the time they all get together, a lot of these armies they've already plundered them very well and on their way back home, and they're trying to chase after them. And this is really kind of a problem. What happens when this attack takes place, though, and the people all go back and pray to Yahweh, God raises up what's called a judge. We're not talking about a courtroom judge. Get that out of your mind. We're talking about a captain of the armies of Israel who is going to enact the judgment of God on those nations that have dared to attack his chosen people. And some of the people that God chooses to lead the armies of Israel are not really willing. This is not what they want to do. In fact, going back to Moses, he really didn't want to do what God called him to do either. God had to persuade him. And we know the names of some of the judges. You've probably heard. You've probably heard of Gideon, if only because you might have stayed in a hotel or a motel where in the side table next to your bed there, you opened it up and there was a hardback Bible and it said, "Placed by the Gideons," and had a little lamp on the front. That organization is named after the judge Gideon, who with a few hundred men actually destroyed tens of thousands of Midianites. It's a very interesting story, actually. There's another one you might have heard of too, and his name is Samson. And he's famous because he's really, really strong and he's got really, really long hair. But he has the disadvantage of getting involved in a relationship with a woman who pertains to the nation that he's fighting. Samson's not the sharpest tool in the shed intellectually, but he's a great fighter. Anyway, this woman, Delilah, I'm sure you've heard her name. It's kind of become one of the better known names to refer to some kind of a backstabbing, betraying woman. She finally betrays him. There's one other judge that you haven't heard of, I'm sure, but it's interesting. There's one that's a woman. I don't know if you know that. One of them is named Deborah. So how's that for women's lib like 3,500 years ago, huh? Anyway, these are the people that were chosen by God to lead in periods usually of crisis. And after somewhere, I think going on 400 years, some people think it's more like around 250 or so. It's kind of hard to date some of these things, but say 300 to 400 years period, being ruled by the judges, these people finally come to the conclusion that they want to have a king, one king over the whole land, not, leadership of 12 different tribes. Because if they have one king, and this king has a conscripted army, that means certain people are set aside that already have weapons. They've already got chariots, they've got horses, they're ready to go. It's going to give Israel a lot more cred with the other nations, and they're going to think twice about attacking them if Israel is more able to defend themselves. So this is when we're going into a period called the United Kingdom. And you'll see under Israelite religion there, it's the third line under that. We talk about the Exodus from Egypt. Exodus is a massive going out, Moses leading the Israelites out. Period of the Judges. Now we're getting to the period of the United Kingdom. Because what happens is all 12 tribes are part of the same kingdom called Israel. There are 3 kings of the United Kingdom. The first king's name is Saul. And Saul is actually from a little tiny tribe. If you look there right above Judah, see the little light blue area? It says Benjamin. Benjamin is the smallest tribe. He is actually from Benjamin, the first king, Saul, or Shaul, as they would say. The second king, David, is from Judah, from the biggest tribe, the tribe of Judah. And after David, that's exactly where the monarchy stays until we have a civil war and a split in the kingdom. So David of the tribe of Judah and his son Solomon after him are the 2 very, very famous kings in the history of Israel here, while it's still united, while all 12 tribes are part of the same nation. David fights many battles to finally defeat all of his enemies, and by the time his son Solomon comes to the throne, Israel is safe and secure and very well-to-do and very respected. Solomon is richer than any other king in the area. He's also reputed to be very wise, and everybody wants to be his friend. Everybody wants to do business with him. Nobody wants to mess with him. Too strong. He's built like 3 big armed cities that are just full of soldiers ready to fight at a moment's notice. And Israel finally has the cred that they're looking for. These are the glory days of ancient Israel. Solomon is the one who actually builds this glorious temple in Jerusalem. It's the first temple, and Solomon is so rich, he overlays the walls of the temple with like sheet gold. It's just a marvel. So this is a glorious period. Now, after Solomon dies, he has many, many sons because he has many, many wives. Unfortunately, the son that takes over after him that is given the privilege is a bit of an idiot. His name is Rehoboam. And I'll tell you the story of what he does, but he makes such a bad governing decision on the third day of his reign, that the 10 northern tribes just say, sorry, we're seceding, and they leave, and they become a nation on their own. And the 10 tribes in the north, they keep the name Israel. And in the south, the southern kingdom ends up being Judah. It ends up being Benjamin right above Judah there, right? A great deal of the tribe of Simeon is a part of that kingdom too. There's actually a little bit of Simeon that's in a completely different area up north that isn't shown on this map, I don't think. And also there's another tribe called the tribe of Levi. This was actually the tribe of Moses in Jerusalem, which is the capital. This map makes it look like it's in Benjamin there, but it's in Judah. This is the capital that David took for himself and where Solomon reigned and where Solomon built the temple. And the priestly tribe of Israel that takes care of the temple are all sons of Levi, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, aka Israel. So we have a lot of the tribe of Levi there. Levi's the priestly tribe. They are the ones who take care of all of the ritual at the temple in Jerusalem. They don't receive a land inheritance. The inheritance they receive is the service of the temple, which is considered to be a great honor. So the vast majority of people, here's the conclusion, the vast majority of the people in the southern kingdom are from the tribe of Judah. The vast majority of the land is the inheritance of Judah. So the southern kingdom ends up being called Judah. So in the kingdom of Judah, you might have Judahites and Benjamites and Levites, but just because you are a citizen of the nation, even if you're not actually a descendant of Judah and literally part of the tribe of Judah, you still could be called a Judahite because you are a citizen of the nation of Judah. So these are the two things now that Judahite, or Jew, as it's been shortened to, means. It can mean a descendant of the tribe of Judah, or it can mean a citizen of this southern kingdom of Judah. And let me show you what it looks like after it splits. This pink part is Israel in the north, and the purpley blue part is Judah in the south there. And Jerusalem remains the capital of Judah as it was before. But Israel sets up new capitals, and these are enemies now. The Israelites are not going to go to the temple in Jerusalem and worship the God they're supposed to worship, Yahweh. They immediately start worshiping all kinds of other gods. And Judah has its problems with idolatry too. Judah has a few good kings, though, 4 of them that don't permit the worship of idols. So at least they've got that. Israel, I don't think, even has one. So we're in a 2-kingdom period. We call it the divided kingdom. See here on the 4th line under Israelite religion, divided kingdom, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now, many prophets are sent to both kingdoms, challenging the people to repent. It's normally for idolatry or unethical practices, usually both, actually. And the northern kingdom just never repents. And in the 8th century BCE, the armies of Assyria, this great empire that has developed, Assyria, come against the northern nation of Israel and systematically besiege all of their cities and conquer them. Okay, and 723 to 721, I think. Let me look. See what it says here. I don't even have it here. Actually, look at this. Go past my maps here. What you're going to have here is you're going to have 2 pages after this that actually are going to give you a little bit more detail. This is the first one here. But as you can see here, it gives you a few dates here that I didn't mention before. But here it says the northern kingdom of Israel conquered and destroyed by Assyria in 721. So I was right, 723 to 721 BCE. Now, Judah is around for about 1.5 centuries after that. It's not that the Assyrians don't want to also destroy Judah. But when they come against Judah and they come to Jerusalem, they're not able to conquer it. And the theological explanation for this is because the king that is reigning over Judah at the time, his name is Hezekiah, which means the strength of God. He's one of God loves him. He's one of God's favorites. He's loves God with all his heart, does not commit idolatry. And so the prophet Isaiah, you might have heard of him. He's a heavyweight. Comes to him and tells him that there's going to come a day, King Hezekiah, when God is going to punish your people of Judah for their sins, but it's not during your lifetime. And so Hezekiah gets to go to his grave in peace, and the Assyrians cannot conquer him. It's about a century and a half later, after the Assyrians have been conquered by the Babylonians, led by this king named Nebuchadnezzar. And sometimes you'll see Nebuchadnezzar, same guy. And he actually doesn't want to conquer Judah. He actually is done conquering the Assyrian Empire, and probably the biggest thing on his mind right now is Egypt. And he tries to make a covenant with the kings of Judah. But after Hezekiah, there has not been a good king. And the kings are not only foolish, but they're also very arrogant and full of themselves. And they basically tell Nebuchadnezzar, our forefathers fought off the Assyrians, and, we can hold you off too. And so Nebuchadnezzar has no real choice. He kicks their butts and takes them captive to Babylon, simply because they wouldn't make a treaty with him. They would have been a vassal state of Babylon. They would have had to pay a tax, but they could have continued their lives just as they lived them. It's a little bit better than having all of your cities destroyed, your temple completely destroyed and ransacked, and all of your people taken captive to a foreign country. Ouch. So this is the Babylonian exile of the Jews. And again, now we're right in the middle of the Axial Age. So something interesting happens in the captivity here. After about 50 years, the next major empire, which is Persia, led by great King Cyrus, and he's called great for a number of reasons, but he defeats the Babylonians, and great King Cyrus likes the Jews, and in the first year of his reign, he issues a decree that all of the Jews that want to can go back to their land of Judah and may rebuild their cities, rebuild their temple, rebuild their land. Of course, there'll be a vassal kingdom of Persia, but that's sounding pretty good right about now. And so he actually is the one who decrees the order that they can rebuild their land. So a lot of Jews already have good lives in Babylon at this point. It's not like they all go back. In fact, it's a smaller percentage of them that do. But when they go back, they finally rebuild everything. It takes a number of decades. And it takes a while in the temple too, but we call this the second temple. Why? Because of course the first one was destroyed by the Babylonians. This one's built in the same place on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. We call it Mount Moriah, and you'll find out why later. It's not as glorious as Solomon's temple, of course, because these people coming back aren't rich, There's no gold on the walls anywhere or anything like that. But this is called the Second Temple. But the interesting thing about the Second Temple period is that religion has changed a lot. First of all, it's not just priests at the temple doing sacrifices and doing blessings, but during the captivity, common Jews, lay people, that means people that aren't religious professionals, they're not priests or anything, lay people have gotten together on the Sabbaths, Shabbat, which are Saturdays. That's the day that we're supposed to take a rest and not work. It's not Sunday, by the way, it's Saturday. We'll talk more about that. But anyway, they start meeting in these groups that in the Greek are called synagogues and literally means just gatherings. And these have nothing to do with priestly practices or prayers or sacrifices or anything. These, again, are lay people meeting, and they want to be taught the teachings of the prophets, and they want to learn about the Mosaic covenant, and they want to learn about the different messages from the different prophets, because there are prophecies that God is going to bring them back to their land and rebuild them. And so, of course, they're very interested in this. So this is the beginning of worship in synagogues. And so when they come back to their land, they continue to meet in synagogues. Now, there's only one temple. The one temple is in Jerusalem. That's still run by the priests after they rebuild it, the second temple. But everywhere that there is a village or a community of the Jews all over the world where they've spread, they're meeting in synagogues on the Sabbath. And again, this has nothing to do with priests. We'll find out later on that there is we've talked about this in talking about the Axial Age, there's a new religious profession that arises in the context of synagogue worship, and these are the rabbis, and they're spiritual teachers, kind of the heroes of the common people. They have nothing to do with the ritual worship that's going on in Jerusalem at the temple, and on the major holidays, people do try to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem if they can, at least make a couple of the big festivals a year. But synagogues are something that they're involved in every single Sabbath day, wherever they live. So that's the first thing that's notable. We have two different kinds, two different bases, if you will, of Judaic religion. Second thing is they come back monotheists. Now, this is pretty interesting because before we talked about this. Anytime you think there are other gods, but you have a rule that you're not supposed to worship them, that's not monotheism, that's henotheism. Monotheism doesn't believe there's any other gods. So if you think that there are any other gods, and certainly if you're worshiping them, you're not a monotheist. And we talked about this before in depth, going over the different theisms, so I won't go over it again now. We actually talked over, again, going over the axial age, so you should be pretty familiar with what henotheism is and how it differs from monotheism, how it differs from polytheism. So we're going to talk about, in this period, all the different changes. And this is the first time that they start believing that there's a battle between angels and demons going on in the heavenly realms, this cosmic dualism. It's the first time they start teaching about resurrection from the dead, final judgment, heaven and hell. And it's the beginning of this idea that at the very end of the world, the last days, there's going to be a final battle between good and evil, where good is going to finally be victorious, after which we will return to some kind of a perfect kingdom, a paradisal state. The viewpoints are many and various, but we're going to talk a lot about these beliefs that changed in the axial age. And again, when the Jews come back from captivity, they believe some things they did not believe when they went into captivity. Brand new things that never existed before. Monotheism didn't exist before. Now, here's where it's interesting. The first monotheism actually comes out of Persia. Remember, it was King Cyrus of Persia that set the Jews free. So when the Persians take over Babylon, they bring this new monotheistic religion that they have called Zoroastrianism, and the Jews are exposed to it. And so scholars today notice that both Zoroastrianism and Second Temple Judaism are believing these new doctrines that have never existed before in other religions. This idea of God having some kind of a nemesis, some kind of a detractor, and God's angels are fighting the detractors' demons, the fallen angels, and there'll be a final battle between good and evil in the end times. All of this is brand new. What's interesting is in Zoroastrianism, now this is early Zoroastrianism, it changes a lot, but in early Zoroastrianism and early Second Temple Judaism, they believe a lot of the same things. So whether you think that the Zoroastrians had more of an effect on the Jews, or the Jews had more of an effect on the Zoroastrians, there's definitely some communication taking place. But these are the first two monotheistic religions. And we mentioned that before, again, talking about theisms and in talking about the axial age, we mentioned both times. Now, eventually the Jews also move up into the northern areas. Remember, that used to be the nation of Israel that was destroyed by the Assyrians so many centuries ago. They finally settle all up in the northern area too. We call it the Galil, or Galilee. It's called that to this day. And after the Persian Empire is finally overthrown by the Greek Empire, being led by a Macedonian named Alexander the Great. Maybe you've heard of him because he was great. Anyway, when Alexander died, his kingdom was split between four generals. And the two, how shall we say, sub-Greek kingdoms that alternately rule over Judah, actually we can call it Judea now because that's Greek, are the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid. The Ptolemaic are the Egyptian Greeks, think Cleopatra, and they rule over Judah for a while. Judah's a vassal kingdom, but then control is taken away from them by the Seleucids, and they're the Syrian Greeks. And so Judea becomes a vassal kingdom of the Seleucid Empire, the Syrian Greeks. And there is finally a revolt by a priestly family called the Hasmoneans, and they're nicknamed the Maccabees. You might have heard of the Maccabean Revolt. Means the hammers. And it's kind of a nickname for the family. But they actually start a revolt against the Seleucids because one of their rulers actually goes in and defiles the temple in a way that's just uh, unheard of in Judaism, and it's the final blow. And so this priestly family starts a war, and they win, amazingly enough, and they manage to get all of the Greeks out of their land. They have self-rule, though, for less than a century. It doesn't last that long until the Romans come along. And the Roman Empire, of course, is the most powerful empire that's ever lived. And Judea, the Jews in Judea end up being a vassal kingdom of the Roman Empire. And it is during the Roman Empire that we see Jesus born, and his whole ministry takes place. So in this period, we'll talk about that, because obviously we're going to talk about the teachings of Jesus next, and it would be nice to know the different kinds of theological and political groups that exist in this time, and the different kinds of messianic expectations that different people hold. And once we learn a few of those things, it's going to make some of the dialogues in the Gospels, if you've ever read them, are going to make a whole lot more sense, I think. So we'll talk about this. But eventually what happens is, what is not supposed to happen, what the priests are supposed to prevent. The Romans have left the priests in control, but probably their greatest responsibility is making sure that a rebellion doesn't start against Rome. The priests are supposed to use their God-given power, religious legitimation, to convince the people that it's God's will for the people to be good Roman citizens, pay their taxes on time, and certainly don't start any kinds of revolts. So when finally a revolt breaks out, it breaks out in 66 CE and goes to 70 CE when it's finally completely crushed. After this revolt, the priests are punished. The temple is completely destroyed, taken apart stone by stone. That's the end of the Second Temple. So obviously that's the end of the Second Temple period in Second Temple Judaism. And there is another revolt, by the way, about half a century later, called the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 to 135. And this is when a lot of the Jews actually get kicked out of anywhere in Judea, anywhere around Jerusalem. They're not allowed to live there anymore. They're sent out all over the world in what we call the diaspora, the Great Dispersion. And that's the second punishment for Rome. This first punishment in 70 CE, when the temple's destroyed, this is a major one, and I'll tell you why. Because now the priests have no power at all. They've lost their position. They've lost their temple. So remember, you had two power bases, the rabbis that were famous in the whole synagogue system, the spiritual teachers, and then of course you had the priests, the Levitical priests. Well, now the priesthood's irrelevant. The temple is destroyed, the priests are out of power, so the rabbis end up running all of Judaism. And their theology, which is a lot different than what the priest theology was, this ends up being the theology that lives on. Okay, so this is why the fourth period we call it Rabbinic Judaism, because it's rabbi-led. And even today we're still in Rabbinic Judaism, although it's been a long time, 1900 years since then, of course, 1900 and a half. But obviously the rabbis still lead Judaism. The temple hasn't been rebuilt. The temple can't be rebuilt because standing right now where the temple, first and second temple used to stand, is a beautiful building called the Dome of the Rock. And the Temple Mount in Jerusalem also has not just the Dome of the Rock, but it has a mosque on it called the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the southern end of the Temple Mount. And this is considered the third holiest place in the world to Islam. So, obviously the temple can't be rebuilt. You'd have to remove the Dome of the Rock first. And I don't think that's going to happen. That'd be a major world war if you tried to do that. So we're still in the rabbinical period, and we're going to talk more about the rabbinical period, going into the Middle Ages and so on later on. But these are the forming periods I want to get down now. And today, of course, still in Judaism, synagogues are the main basis. Now, if you're a Reform Jew, you might go to temple on the Sabbath, but temple is synagogue. It's just been renamed, I guess, kind of to signify that God dwells, with his people in the synagogue, and that this has, replaced the temple. And but there's no, unless your rabbi's up there chopping up animals and draining their blood and burning them, and then pronouncing blessings on you as he's sprinkling blood on you, it's not a temple. It's really a synagogue. You just kind of renamed it there. And again, synagogues widespread everywhere Jews live, all over the Roman Empire. Synagogues, they have meetings. Now there doesn't have to be a building. The synagogue just means the meeting. So a lot of synagogues don't have buildings necessarily. In fact, we don't even really see synagogue buildings at all until about the 1st century, until about the time of Jesus. And from the 1st century, there's some suspected synagogues, but I think there's about 7, and things are always changing. Scholars are always debating, but I think there's about 7 that are accepted as being synagogues for sure, that there's not that much debate about in the 1st century. And by the 3rd century, there's many, many, many. And so a lot of the early synagogues didn't necessarily have a building just for synagogue meetings. They might have met in someone's home or courtyard or out in a field or in the gates of the city, the open area inside the gates of the city. Who knows? So these are the 4 major periods here. And again, on the next few pages here, next 2 pages rather, I have some more events, okay? And this first page here is the first 2 periods. And let's go the right way. The yellow here, this is the patriarchal period. Remember, it starts with the patriarch Abraham, and it goes all the way until they're in Egypt, being subjected to slavery, because that's when the last of the patriarchs die. Remember, it's Abraham's great-grandsons that are in Egypt. And when that 4th generation dies, they're in there like another 400 years or so. And so the second period here, where Moses leads them out, we call Israelite religion, because they found the nation Israel, and they're referred to as Israelites because they are all descendants of that one man, Jacob, who was renamed Israel. And this is this period here. Now, actually, at the very bottom here, where it says Persia conquers Babylon, and then under it, King Cyrus the Great of Persia issues the decree. If you want, you could take those 2, and you could tack them onto the next period here, because that is what causes the return from the exile. And this is what we call Second Temple Judaism. And it begins as the Second Temple is rebuilt and Torah is reinstated. That means that the rituals of the priests begin at the temple again, keeping the people in covenant with God. And we go through an awful lot of events here that I'm going to talk about, but not now. Suffice to say, at the very end of that yellow print there, you see that the first revolt is crushed by the Romans, and the Second Temple is destroyed in 70 by the Roman general Titus. And after that, of course, Second Temple period is over because Second Temple period is destroyed. And so this is the final period here, the rabbinical period. Now, this only takes us to about 500 or 600 CE. And obviously, there's a lot of stuff after that. But this is the main, these are the main sequence of events that I want you to understand just in the foundations of Judaism before and as it gets spread all over the world. And we'll talk more about the medieval period lately. So anyway, that's where we're at. And next time, we're going to talk about the story of Abraham, but we're going to talk first a little bit about what covenantal theology is about, because again, it's something that you'll probably find interesting, and you might find out that you've learned some improper things about it. Sometimes Christians used Jews, and this went on for many centuries, by the way, better part of 1700 years. Christians had very strange ideas about how wicked and self-righteous and cocky and rebellious Jews were. And so they kind of made up all kinds of theologies to make the Jews the perfect example of how not to be. And we're unlearning a lot of that today, thankfully, because it just isn't a correct understanding of Jewish theology. So we're going to talk about covenantal theology and what it means and what kind of wrong ideas you might have heard and why they're wrong. And having understood covenantal theology, then we're going to go on. We're going to talk about this first covenant that God makes with Abraham. And of course, the second covenant, important one, is the covenant that God makes, as we mentioned, with Moses. So I think that's all we're going to do right now. And we're going to come back, talk about covenant theology and Abraham next time. Thanks a lot.